to the Shepherd School of Music's Morrison Theater at Brockman Hall for Opera. I have the distinct honor of being the dean here at Rice University's Music School, and on behalf of the faculty, students, and staff, we are thrilled to be hosting this month's Scientia lecture. Rice enjoys an incredible collection of faculty, scholars, and creators, and our school is proud to be a part of a marvelous series of conversations in response to the ambitious prompt, how are we answering the call to help create a better world? To answer this question, you're going to meet some of our music faculty and students today, and hopefully enjoy our topical response entitled Music and Environmental Crisis. 2 weeks ago, the engineering school presented a fascinating talk on environmental crisis and the promise of new technologies to create more renewable energy. Today, however, our goal is to place these questions in a different domain, from the realm of science into the realm of music. In order to focus our attention on the program, with the limited time we have, I'm going to keep this introduction very brief. So rather than listing the myriad accomplishments of today's artists, scholars, and students, I'll just direct you all to please go to our Shepherd School website for more information. We're very proud to be sharing the stage with a few exceptionally talented current students at the Shepherd School. On the second half of our program today, we will hear from Nikki Song, a composer and DMA candidate who has enjoyed commissions and performances of her work around the world. Performing Nikki's piece, What Happens If Pipes Burst, will be a string quintet featuring undergraduate and graduate students, Astrid Nakamura, Yuming Ma, Julia Kirk, Nathan Su, and Kevin Fink. After hearing Nikki's work, and to close out our time together, we will be joined on stage by Dr. Alexander Kiefer. Dr. Kiefer is Associate Professor of Musicology and Speaker of the Faculty Senate at Rice. Her book, Debussy's Critics, Sound, Affect, and the Experience of Modernism, explores ideas about sensation, listening, and emotion in early 20th century Debussy within the context of emerging scientific discourse on psychology and the senses. To more substantially introduce our presentation, after I get off the stage, we will hear from Dr. Danielle Ward-Griffin, Assistant Professor of Musicology and the 2023 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship winner in support of her forthcoming book, Televising Opera, Broadcasting and Performance in Anglo-American Culture. Following Danielle will be Anthony Brandt, Professor of Composition and Theory and, coincidentally, Director of Scientia. We will enjoy an excerpt from Dr. Brandt's recent opera, Cassandra, being performed by Bethany Self, the current Interim Director of Opera Studies at the Shepherd School, a renowned vocal coach and pianist who will be joined herself by Professor of Voice and Grammy Award winner Ana Maria Martinez, who is back in Houston today after enjoying rave reviews for her current role as the Countess in LA Opera's The Marriage of Fear. Dr. Ward-Griffin has taken the lead in shaping today's program that explores how we are hopefully creating a better world. Thank you, Danielle, for your work in bringing us to this moment. Now we can finally begin. Please join me in welcoming Danielle Ward-Griffin to stage.
Over 10 years ago, ecomusicologist Aaron S. Allen proclaimed that the environmental crisis is not only the fault of failed engineering, bad science, ecological misunderstanding, poor accounting, and bitter politics. It is also a failure of holistic problem solving, interpersonal relations, ethics, imagination, and creativity. In short, the environmental crisis is a failure of culture. Of course, Allen here is speaking about culture broadly, about the ways in which our society works or fails to work. But if we narrow our focus to imagination and creativity, the usual domain of the arts, we might ask, how can music rise to this moment, right now, and speak to our current environmental crisis in a meaningful way? It's a difficult question, one that raises a number of issues about how we think of music in the environment. Our study of music has typically celebrated the triumph of man over nature, focused on human music over non-human sound, and has tended to separate culture and the environment. an idea that Alexandra Kiefer will explore later in her paper. But I still think the question is worth asking, particularly in our current geological age, as humans struggle with what to do in the face of a crisis that they themselves have brought. As an introduction to today's Scientia lecture and the featured pieces by the Shepherd School composers, I'd like to think through a few examples of how other composers have grappled with this question in the past, and break it down into 3 overlapping parts. First, in what spirit should musicians engage with the environment? Second, in the face of looming catastrophe, why bother making music at all? And third, what is the impact of portraying environmental crisis in music? So first, in what spirit should musicians engage with the environment? Classical music composers, of course, have had a long history of idealizing nature, particularly through a nostalgic, pastoral mode that many musicologists have sought to disavow from their favorite works. Recently, however, some works have tapped into what Alexander Redding has called an apocalyptic mode. That is, musical works that seek to sound the alarm to an acute crisis. Unlike earlier pieces, in these new works, environmental crisis emerges not just as a metaphor, not just as one political issue among many, but rather as the fundamental issue. For example, Canadian composer R. Murray Schafer's famous 1977 book, The Tuning of the World, warned against human changes to our acoustic environment and brought attention to noise pollution in particular. Through the World Soundscapes Project in Vancouver, he made location recordings and stressed listening as a way to attune oneself to the world, which he considered to be a Pythagorean macrocosmic musical composition. Schafer's approach has been criticized for settler colonial bias, as well as for privileging uninhabited soundscapes over urban ones. But what I find most interesting is the paradox at the center of Schafer's work. Despite critiquing the forces of industrialization and capitalism that have led to climate destruction, he suggests that the solution is, in part, more human control, encouraging the study of the acoustic environment so people can, quote, improve the orchestration of the world, end quote. Here then, the musician remains the architect of sounds and the human the center of the world. More recently, scholars and composers have argued for a less anthropocentric view. Humans, they argue, should step aside to allow for the emergence of a place-based music. John Luther Adams, for example, has sought to channel seismic data on Alaska into electronic sound, resulting in pieces such as The Place Where You Go to Listen. Like Schafer, Adams sees his music as part of the tuning of the world, but has sought to decenter humans and instead see them as part of a web of relations. As he put it, the central truth of ecology is that everything in this world is connected to everything else. The great challenge now facing the human species is to live by this truth. This fundamental idea brings us to our second question. Why bother making music in the face of environmental catastrophe? The composer I study, Benjamin Britten, faced this question when his home in the English seaside town of Autrey flooded in the historic North Sea floods of 1953, 70 years ago this past month. Britten had always claimed that his music was written for and came from Autrey, and he even founded a yearly festival there. Thanks to the Britten Cares archive, we can see how Britten dealt with environmental catastrophe at his doorstep. He had to bring in contractors, he bought boots and overalls to rescue his beloved record collection from his flooded cellar, and he wrote to his sister that the whole affair had left him sick and unable to work. It was only with the support of his community, especially neighbors who took him in, that he was able to resume composition. Nearly 5 years later, flooding once again appeared in Britten's life in the form of his opera for children, Noise Flood. Staged in a local church, this opera has typically been understood as a modern-day attempt to revive a supposedly lost organic community, particularly through the reenactment of the medieval mystery play of Noah and the Great Flood. In Britain's version, what resolves the flood is the gathering of the community, representing both the human and non-human, including a chorus of children dressed like animals who all sing hymns together with the audience. Both on and off stage then, Britain's approach to environmental crisis was to bring the community together and to focus their attention and energies on a single problem. One final question. What does it mean to musically evoke catastrophe time and again? Does it sound the alarm, or does it risk making crisis into something purely entertaining and thus easy to dismiss? In their 2020 book, Eva Horn and Hannes Berghalle remarked that our present is the future that the environmental movement has been warning us against, and today there is no going back. Listening to Anthony Brand's and Nikki Song's pieces, it seems to me that such music seeks to wrestle with the present moment, with what has become the apocalyptic consciousness of a global threat to us all. Evoking the apocalyptic rather than the nostalgic mode, these works show what happens when we fail to listen. Nikki's What Happens if Pipes Burst channels the immediate and local impacts of climate change, as experienced during the Texas freeze of 2021, while Anthony's opera explores the curse of seeing the future, but not being believed. At the end of the opera, the climate scientists' pronouncements are dismissed as just a bird song, pretty little tweets. It's telling that by being transformed into new, non-human sound, they become more liable to be ignored. But it is perhaps too easy to call for us to simply listen to these bird songs, as though doing so would translate into an immediate solution. As we have seen, these are not the first musical calls to action, and I doubt they'll be the last. But they do show what else music offers, a way for us to process our current moment with what it means to live with awareness on a damaged planet. In this respect, music is indeed part of the culture of environmental crisis, a way to tangibly express how much we have lost and still stand to lose. And now I'll turn it over to Anthony Brand.
Thank you to Dean Loden and Professor Ward-Griffin. I'm honored to be speaking to all of you today. Ecomusicologist Aaron Allen isn't alone in saying that addressing climate change is more than a scientific problem. Here is Robert Davies, physicist and climate scientist at the University of Utah.
My dear consequences to audiences and students, even scientists these days, is that our challenges in meeting this fully entangled suite of ecological and social crises we currently inhabit are almost entirely cultural at this point. And to the extent that technology, physical technology, has a role to play, we pretty much have everything we need. What has thus far remained elusive is the social and cultural technology, which is why I spend quite a bit of time these days telling scientific stories to artists and asking them to bring to bear their artistic voices on retelling these stories in their own way and in ways that can better connect us to them.
What I hear in the words of Allen and Davies is that technology alone isn't enough to save our planet. We also need to move minds and hearts, and for that, we need the arts. In 2020, playwright Nina Bieber and I collaborated on a chamber opera, Cassandra. It focuses on two stories about climate change that need to be told. First, thanks to advances in AI and big data, scientists are able to make better predictions than ever before. And what those predictions tell us, the hotter the Earth warms, the more temperatures will reach levels farther and farther back into prehistory, long before humans inhabited the planet. And second, climate change denial is a deep-rooted and persistent problem. Just last month, the New York Times ran an expose reporting that Exxon scientists in the 1970s made remarkably accurate projections about how fossil fuels would warm the planet, even as Exxon executives publicly insisted on the opposite. Here's former President Trump speaking at the 2020 Davos World Economic Forum.
To embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse. They are the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune telling.
To tell these stories, Nina and I turn to the Greek myth of Apollo and Cassandra. In the myth, the god Apollo propositions the Trojan princess Cassandra. He will give her the gift of prophecy if she becomes his lover. Cassandra rejects him, so Apollo places a curse on her. She'll be able to see the future, but no one will believe her. In our modern retelling, Cassandra is a computer scientist modeling climate change, and Apollo, a venture capitalist who offers to fund her work. The former president's description of climate scientists as, quote, the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers, gets to the heart of the connection we saw to the Cassandra myth. Cassandra was premiered by Opera in the Heights and Musica in February 2020. It's scored for 5 singers and an ensemble of 9 musicians. I'm going to give a short synopsis illustrating it with performance photos from the premiere, and then we're going to perform the opening aria. The opera begins with a TED Talk in which Cassandra describes her goal of building a computer that can predict the future. Impressed by her presentation, Apollo introduces himself and offers to fund her work. In front of skeptical colleagues at Apollo Industries, Cassandra runs her first successful test. Afterwards, Apollo and Cassandra are left alone to celebrate. He attempts to seduce her, but she resists until thankfully they're interrupted. In the scene that follows, an HR employee tries to buy her silence. When she refuses, Cassandra is fired. The next scene takes place in various offices and conference rooms as Cassandra tries to find new employment. Apollo sets out to discredit her, blocking her at every turn, and Cassandra keeps being turned away. At the opera's climax, Cassandra attempts to re-deliver her TED Talk, this time warning more urgently of the dire future facing humankind. But she's shouted down by Apollo and his acolytes. Apollo succeeds in getting everyone to ignore her. The final scene takes place by the sea, where a solemn Cassandra warns of the impending havoc wrought by climate change. But to those around her, as Danielle mentioned, her words amount to no more than the tweeting of birds. At the opera's close, the ancient myth and modern story are brought together. The original and modern Cassandras appear alongside each other. Regrettably, the original Cassandra story has turned out to be a prediction that itself has come true. The opera leaves the audience with the question, is anyone listening? Or will Cassandra's warnings and those of several generations of scientists fall on deaf ears? I strongly believe that music not only offers entertainment and aesthetic enjoyment, it also gives us knowledge about the world. Opera is a particularly impactful way to communicate that knowledge. For instance, about an ecological crisis for which there is near unanimous scientific consensus. And now I'm honored to introduce Shepherd School faculty soprano Ana Maria Martinez and pianist Bethany Self, who will perform the TED Talk aria that opens Cassandra. During the TED Talk, Cassandra mentions the Antikythera. It was discovered in a Greek shipwreck dating from the 1st century BC. The Antikythera is widely regarded as the world's first functional computer used to predict celestial events such as eclipses. And now, scene 1 of Cassandra.
Hello, my name is Nikki Sohn, and I'm a composer and a fourth-year doctoral candidate at the Shepherd School of Music. I'm very honored to be a part of this special lecture along with Dean Loden and the professors that I've been looking up to for years. So Houston's been home for me for the past 4 years, and unfortunately, I have felt the urgency of the state of our planet through many incidences, including the 2021 Texas power crisis. I'm sure if you were in the area, you would have experienced and definitely remember this crisis in February of 2021. The state of Texas suffered a major power crisis. All around the state, we experienced shortage of water, food, and heat, and more than 4.5 million homes and businesses were left without power for several days, including myself. As a composer, I feel that it is important to share my personal experiences and the way that I view through my music. And I think sharing my message through my music is actually one of the greatest powers I have as a composer. So my experience in February 2021 of 2021 has resulted the piece that I'll share with you today, called "What Happens If the Pipes Burst." What Happens If the Pipes Burst is a narrative piece that goes through my experiences during that time. It is loosely in 4 sections, and I will go through each section and explain to you my thought processes behind them and have these wonderful musicians play a bit of each excerpt before hearing the whole piece. I'm sure you have felt the initial loss of power came as a complete shock to me. I have lived in cold climates before, but nothing like this has happened to me before. So the piece begins with a very tense, almost like bubbling of fear type of texture where all strings play an angular texture with fierce melodic line that's played by the first violin. Throughout the pandemic, I had a pet fish named Jolene. I'm sure you guys can kind of tell where I'm going with this. Pandemic was a very lonely and isolated time, so having a pet, something to take care of, was very comforting. But during this freeze, my apartment got so cold, and the next day, I found that Jolene had passed. So the second part of this work is dedicated to my fish Jolene, and it is a slow, intimate lament with longer valued notes, strings playing, simpler texture with delicate harmony. After a few days of the freeze, a sun finally came out and the temperature started to rise. I started to see the ice and a little bit of the snow that we got melt and from the trees to the roof. And so this third section depicts the ice melting, and I used this special technique that can be played by the strings called colegno, where the string player plays with the back of the bow rather than the hair of the bow, and Astrid here will demonstrate a little bit of that. So the third section also includes a lot of pizzicato where the string players pluck the strings rather than bowing the string, and it is bouncy and playful, hoping for the sun to stay, hoping for the power to be back. Great. So even though the temperature had gone up, we still weren't getting the power to be back to the full capacity. So I was at this point filled with anger, frustration, and sadness. I felt truly insignificant, and I realized how we humans are so dependent on the power in the system. So the fourth section is filled with passionate, fast-moving harmony, and it is very forward-driven to show my anger and fear. lastly, when the power fully came back, my apartment blinked twice. Everything turned on for a second, and then gone, and then back running like nothing ever happened. So the piece ends with the 2 power switch on sound. Before hearing the entire work, I'd like to thank these wonderful musicians for their hard work and the time they put together to make my piece come alive. And thank you for coming here today and listening. Thank you.
inspiring to see our composers in Shepherd confronting and wrestling with the effects of anthropogenic climate change, the impact of humanity on the lived environment of our planet, and drawing the complexity of this moment, this heightened awareness of the Anthropocene as a geological age, into their compositional practice. As a music historian, I want to talk briefly at the end of our conversation from a historical vantage, and to try to put the question of music and nature and the Anthropocene in a somewhat broader perspective. To try to think about why music continues to be a vital mode of cultural engagement in this age of questioning and reconceiving the relationship between humanity and nature. Indeed, why and how music might speak in unique ways to this challenge. It is something of a truism in music history that the era in Western Europe and the United States in which much of the core repertoire of classical music was composed in the late 18th and 19th centuries, music was widely considered to rise above the material world, to speak to us of higher realms of existence. A song by Franz Schubert, composed in 1817 to a text by the German poet Franz von Schober, extols the lovely art of music. He writes, quote, "In how many dismal hours, when life's mad tumult wraps around me, have you ignited my heart to warm love and transported me to a better world." In the 20th century, this conviction that music transcends the world transformed into a conviction among many composers that it is concerned with no world at all, hermetically sealed within the bounds of its own formality as a kind of abstract intellectual exercise. This view was famously encapsulated in the Princeton composer Milton Babbitt's 1958 essay, published under the title, "Who Cares If You Listen?", which analogized the 20th century revolution in avant-garde composition to the mid-19th century revolution in theoretical physics. The task of modern music, in Babbitt's view, was to explore the potentialities afforded by the organization of sounds into complex structures. Consequently, the difficulty and unintelligibility of much mid-20th century art music to a broad audience was of no concern. Why should the layman, Babbitt asked, be other than bored and puzzled by what he is unable to understand, music or anything else? Thankfully, our composers in the Shepherd School today think no such thing. But there is this history to the Western art music tradition, the impulse to distance music as art from the particularities of the cultural worlds in which it is created and listened to, that I think continues to inflect the way that the world at large thinks about the tradition of classical music. This is problematic for reasons that are today, I think, somewhat obvious. Music arises out of particular local cultural practices and modes of life. When we talk about expanding and diversifying the repertoire that our students perform and that we teach in our music history curriculum, it is for precisely this reason, because to include the music of diverse communities in our classrooms and our recital halls is part of what it means to value those communities and the expression of their identities in music and song. So this historicizing and particularizing impulse, Pace Milton Babbitt, is essential to understanding music and the work that it does in culture. Music is quite obviously a part of culture. And we music historians are constantly reminding people of that as a counter to the entrenched narrative of classical music as something that somehow transcends or stands apart from the historical world in which this music was created and performed and listened to. And yet, we might be justified in wondering if this is really the whole story, this idea that music straightforwardly and unproblematically belongs entirely in the domain of culture. If indeed the entire problem isn't that music is positioned rather awkwardly between nature and culture, as those terms have been construed by a post-Enlightenment modernity. Music's effects on us, after all, are notoriously difficult to understand with the tools that scholars in the humanities typically apply to culture: symbols, interpretation, representation, meaning. These effects seem mysteriously to extend into the domain of nature, recurring formal features that arose independently in musical cultures all over the world, including the simple integer ratios of the octave and the fifth and certain kinds of patterns in pitch organization. This is a puzzle that has occupied philosophers in the Western European tradition and extending back into the tradition of Greek and Latin antiquity for a very long time, and more recently, cognitive scientists and evolutionary anthropologists. This difficulty in precisely delineating what in our experience of music is part of culture and what is part of nature, I would argue, speaks to a certain kind of inadequacy in our conceptions of culture and its supposed opposition to nature that arose in the European intellectual culture in the 17th and 18th centuries, and that subsequently imprinted itself on the divisions of the modern academy. For music, this meant a division in the intellectual underpinnings of the study of music that was historically new. The aspects of music that could be experientially demonstrated and mathematically modeled, namely the mechanics of vibrating strings and other sounding bodies, was absorbed into science in its emerging modern form. Everything else, that is, the effects of music on the human person and its role in human life, which could not be made properly scientific because of the complications introduced by human variability, became the purview of a cluster of humanistic disciplines. But this division was always awkward. It produced discontents like Babbitt, who attempted to wrest music's essential nature away from culture and to return it to science. It led to persistent and, in my view, unproductive interdisciplinary quarrels about such questions as whether music is a universal language, And in any case, musical effects have always resisted explication within the bounds of culture thus defined. Culture as it would eventually, in mid-20th century anthropology, be theorized as fundamentally premised on symbolic signification. I want to suggest then that the idea so fundamental to modern intellectual inquiry, that nature and culture are distinct and separable domains, does little ultimately to tell us what music is and what it does. Music entangles us with our lived environment. It acts on our material bodies. It demonstrates that the production of meaning in culture, indeed the very possibility of culture, is premised on an endlessly complex set of exchanges between the material and the social, the symbolic and the non-symbolic, the constructed and the given. Perhaps then we might surmise that music can speak to us, can affect us, in a way that we are newly positioned to appreciate in this era of heightened attentiveness to the more troublesome aspects of the modern conception of the divide between nature and culture. An age in which we are realizing that to adequately make sense of the world, we need to cut across these divisions that separate us in the modern academy. Meaningful action on climate change and other imminent environmental challenges requires, as Dr. Ward-Griffin and Dr. Brandt noted, not only climate science, which is of course essential, but also a nuanced appreciation for how we exist in the world as social beings, how we experience and make sense of our shared inhabitants of a material world, and how the social and the material are always necessarily inextricably intertwined. Consequently, once we in music studies cast off the straitjacket of 19th and 20th century art music aesthetics, the idea of music as isolated art object, we can start to appreciate those things that music is uniquely good at as a set of embodied practices that muddle and cut across the distinction between nature and culture, and that make the interpenetration of the social and the material undeniably and experientially palpable. Music can give voice to our collective experience of a world that exceeds our knowledge and our control, subject to disasters, both natural and man-made, as we just heard in Nikki's piece. It calls us to urgent moral action, as we heard in Tony's opera. It powerfully binds us to identities and collectivities in ways that elude our precise articulation. At the risk of ending this lecture with a cliche, there is something about this difficulty of articulation that is, I think, at the core of what music is. In the Western art music tradition, it has often been a pretext for so many assertions of music's independence from the world. And yet, I would argue, it is precisely the thing that makes music enormously powerful as an intervention in the world. That concludes the lecture portion of our time today, and I think all of our presenters would be happy to take any questions that the audience might have.